Next, I'd like to welcome Indy Nelson. Indy is a recent graduate of Business Administration at the University of California, Berkeley, and he is currently the Executive Vice President of Business Development at LED Exchange. He's going to talk with us about shifting the debate from climate change to air quality. Please welcome Indy.
Great, thank you for that welcoming introduction. I have a presentation that I think we're going to set up in just a moment. Phenomenal. All right, my mic is on. Great. Again, my name is Indy Nelson, and for the past few years, I've been doing research in the correlation between air quality and climate change. But before we talk about air quality and climate change, let's have an understanding of where emissions come from, where do they go, in addition to our electrical grid. So when we're looking at electricity generation in the United States, about 68% comes from fossil fuels, 39% of which comes from coal. And as a whole, that produces 2 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide each year. So when we're looking at the chart on the right, gas and other forms produces 500 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, whereas coal produces 1.5 billion. And that affects our life, that affects our health. And that affects climate change as well. So 39% comes from electricity, or 39% of our electricity comes from coal. And as I mentioned, that produces a lot of carbon dioxide. When we're looking at natural gas, obviously fracking is a challenge, but 22% of our grid comes from natural gas. As we move on to nuclear in the United States is 19% of our electricity. And in fact, in the last 10 years, we actually purchase missiles from Russia and have turned those into fuel for nuclear reactors, which is a really phenomenal opportunity to take a missile that would destroy a city to actually power a city. Now, as we move on, 6% of our grid comes from hydro. Now, the challenge with hydro is we've really reached the ceiling of increased capacity for hydro. And when you build a dam, there's environmental challenges that occur with that dam. And renewable sources, wind, 4.4% of our grid. Now, wind is a phenomenal opportunity, and here's why. The amount of space that a 2.5 megawatt turbine would take is about an acre. So if you look at a square, it takes about an acre of space. However, it's only the base of that actually takes the land. Around that wind, for the rest of that acre, you can still farm, or you can still utilize that land. And when you compare that to solar, solar takes a lot more land than wind. In addition, wind produces twice the amount of energy as the equivalency of solar, because half the year, 49% of the year, you're actually generating energy from a wind turbine. It's a phenomenal opportunity that will continue to advance. The return is sometimes less than 5 years. Biomass is approximately 1.7%. When we're looking at that is a renewable source. And petroleum, 23 million metric tons of carbon dioxide comes from petroleum. In perspective, if you have an Apple product, all right, if you purchased a MacBook, if you have an iPhone, as a whole, 38 million metric tons of carbon dioxide is produced from Apple each year, from the manufacturing and the consumption of energy to use that laptop. So when you put it in perspective, 1% of our grid comes from petroleum, and that's almost equivalent to about 60 to 70% of the metric tons produced from Apple products globally. Now, everyone talks about solar. Solar is a great opportunity to increase. It's only 1% of our grid. 0.4% of 1% comes from solar. Solar is a great opportunity for houses. Takes a lot of land. It's very toxic to produce. I am an advocate for solar and wind. I don't think that's going to replace fossil fuels. It's unrealistic, and I'll explain in a second why. Geothermal, same with solar, 0.4%. Now let's for a moment take a step back and understand what is a metric ton of carbon dioxide. What does that mean? And when we look at a balloon such as this in Copenhagen in Denmark, we have the understanding that it's a balloon 33 feet high. That is a metric ton of carbon dioxide. So visualize that in your mind. We as a human race produce 35.3 billion balloons a year of metric tons, 5.3 in the United States, 10.3 in China. And for myself, I'm from the Bay Area. A third of the emissions that are within the Bay Area comes from China. So it's not just a United States of America problem. It's a global challenge when we're looking at emissions. And that is something that, as a whole, we must visualize and understand. That in the United States, yes, we are making a difference each day, but China is going through an industrial revolution that we did 150 years ago. And if we do the same amount of emissions within China that we did 150 years ago, our planet is out of luck. Now, as we continue, when you're emitting 35.3 billion of those balloons, not all of which goes into the atmosphere. And as we saw yesterday on that film, some of which goes into the ocean, producing acid, which ultimately is a challenge for our oceans, as well as the air that we breathe. So 55% of all emissions go into the atmosphere. Now, here's a fundamental and interesting fact, and this is what the presentation is fundamentally about, changing the course of understanding from climate change to air quality for the people in the United States that don't understand climate change or don't believe in it. And the fact is when you drive to work or when you enter a plane to come to a conference such as this, the emissions that are produced does not impact our environment for 30 to 50 years. And that is an environmentally interesting thought process, that it takes 30 to 50 years for a lag time effect for our emissions to increase the temperature of our planet. Now let me put into perspective for a moment. Those 35.3 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide, the 55% that goes in the atmosphere affects your life today, affects your health, it affects asthma rates continuously rise. However, climate temperature does not rise for 30 to 50 years. So what we emit today will not impact temperature for that amount of time. Now, specifically to health, 1 out of 7 people on this planet die each year because of air quality degradation, whether that's in a house or whether that's when you're outside. Asthma rates have doubled, if not tripled, in the last 100 years. When you're looking at the perspective of health and air quality, it's undeniable. No politician would ever say that the 13,000 Americans that die from coal each year is not happening, because then they would say that the American Lung Association is not correct, right? And when you're looking globally, the World Health Organization says 7 million people a year die. 3 to 7 million. That's happening today. Those coal plants are impacting our lives. And that is a huge challenge. Put climate change aside for a moment and only care about air quality, and that's how you can impact change for the 35% of America that does not believe that human activity is what is causing global warming. 35%. Think of that for a moment. Out of 100 people, 35 people do not agree that climate change is impacted by human activity. And 18% of this country don't even believe in climate change. So when we're looking at the numbers, and when our politicians in Congress state on May 23rd that 49% of our Senate does not believe in human activity causing climate change, that is a challenge. That's huge. Now, putting aside the 14% of America that actually thinks Congress is doing a great job, it's still a challenge that our politicians that we elect do not believe in the most impact that we can have in a generation, which is now. So when we're looking at, we're the last generation that actually can make a difference, but our senators don't believe that it's human activity. And they don't believe in it for one aspect, because of lobbying. So let's for a moment understand, what do humans have as a priority day by day? What do we care about? For myself, I cared about school. I wanted to get good grades. But if you are living paycheck to paycheck like the 44% of America, how are you supposed to invest in something that you don't even understand? And when we're looking at paycheck by paycheck, we also need to understand, what are the priorities of people? So as you can see here, family is a priority. If you have children, that's going to be a priority in your life. Health is a priority. But the number one understanding of air quality and climate change is not having less resources and degrading your quality of life. But the question is, how do you have a better quality of life by using less? An example of that would be a Tesla, the most safest car in the road. If you got into an accident in a Tesla, you're most likely going to survive, as 2 people have died in a Tesla, right, out of the billion miles that have been driven. But you compare that to a gasoline vehicle, And if you compare some wrecks, you would die in a gasoline vehicle and be saved in an electric vehicle. You're using less of a resource, you're having a better quality of life. Now, going into lighting. So I work for a company called LED Exchange, and for a moment, let's look at a case study of something that we have technology to change today. Something that is inexpensive, that a human being that is part of a family would actually do. So when we're looking at this, there's 6 billion of these A-lamp bulbs in the world. And if you were to, in the United States, excuse me. And if you were to take these 6 billion bulbs, 33% are CFL, 64% of incandescents, retrofit those to LEDs, you'd save equivalent of $519 billion in energy savings. But more than that is you'd save 2.9 billion metric tons. So in perspective, if you were to look at the emissions in 2014 that we've emitted, and if you were to replace A-lamp bulbs to LEDs, you'd save the equivalency of 55% of all the emissions that we emitted last year, or replacing coal for a year and a half for those emissions. Those are real-life situations that you can actually make a difference and change today. So what we've done is developed a technology and a software on a website that you can determine what type of bulb you have, match it to an LED, and actually purchase it on the site. You actually have the technology today to make a difference. So if you were to spend $5 on an LED, you're saving $250 within your family from an incandescent to an LED. It's really interesting when you look at statistics such as that. 2 more slides. Think for a moment, can we together as a country prevent environmental destruction? Well, we have in the past. On December 7th of 1941, this country was attacked. Almost 3,000 sailors were killed in Pearl Harbor, and the next day we declared war. 3.5 years later, after we've changed our economy, we defeated the enemy at that time. And as a country, we came together. Now forward that to 9/11. 9/11, we as a country came together and said that we're going to fight terrorism. And we've lost almost 10,000 soldiers from that. We are still in war. And whether you believe in war, putting that aside, the country still came together. So we do have the technology to change. The mindsets needs to be changed to what impacts our life today. And with that, I open the floor for 2 minutes of questions. Thank you very much. So let's do thank you. So we're going to do a fire round of questions. Hopefully I can get 2 or 3 questions in the next 2 minutes. If you can limit a question to 10 seconds, and hopefully I will be able to answer it.
How much might it cost the average American to retrofit their house with LED bulbs?
So that's a great question. So the average home in America, there's 132 million homes in the United States. 77 million are owned by a household. So they're privately owned. When you're looking at that question, the average house has 46 bulbs. They're about $5 a bulb to retrofit. It's about $200. Now you're paying that off in about a year and a half. So if you were to use a credit card to purchase those bulbs, leverage that debt, which means that you're just using the interest that you'd pay on that year, then you'd still pay off those bulbs in about a year and a half with the interest that you do to pay those bulbs. That answers your question. I think we have time for one last question. If there is, very quickly, yes.
Are you making bulbs now that are direct DC, so they don't have drivers and they can be directly connected to PV panels?
Say that once more. I couldn't understand the beginning of the question.
Are you making DC-based bulbs
Okay,
that
so
don't have drivers? They can go directly from photovoltaic panels to be powered directly to the light bulb instead of having to go through the inversion and the conversion from DC to AC back to DC.
So first off, LEDs are DC in a fundamental aspect. If you're talking about fluorescent bulbs, yes, you can have that, and that bypasses the ballast. When you're looking at solar and going to the LEDs, primarily the fundamentals of LEDs is you're saving on efficiency of power, right? So you're able to reduce the amount of power that you use from the solar. I can also talk to you outside as well and further answer that question. So with that, thank you very much.